Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Ripp. I'm a horticulture outreach specialist for Sauk County. And I have today with me Andrea Ackerman, who is a horticultural outreach specialist from Brown County. We'll be your moderators for today. Please use the Q&A feature to ask all of your questions. You should be able to find this at the bottom of your screen if you are on a laptop. If you're using a cell phone or a tablet, you may need to tap the screen to bring up the menu with the Q&A feature. We will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation today. We are not using the chat feature, so please do not put your questions in the chat. Please use the Q&A function. We're recording this webinar, and the link to the recording will be on the Extension Horticulture website after. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Ms. Susan Carpenter. She is a native plant garden curator with the UW-Madison Arboretum. Susan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tim. I'm so glad to be here today, first day of Pollinator Week, and thank you for inviting me. So I'll be talking about pollinator gardens, some general information about plant selection and garden care. So a pretty simple formula that I like to use is that native plants, I will be emphasizing native plants here because native plants really make the best pollinator habitat. And so here we see a picture of one of the gardens here at the Arboretum. This is a wet mesic prairie garden. And just to describe what mesic means, this is an area that has slightly more moisture than a dry area would have. So mesic means right within the middle of the range from wet to dry. And if it's a wet mesic, it's slightly to the wetter end of that spectrum. So we see some great pollinator plants blooming here. This is a midsummer scene. So we have the white mountain mint. We have some prairie blazing star, those purple spikes. We have some Culver's root, the white spikes, and other plants present in this garden. So pollinator, when you put in a garden like this, you automatically are creating pollinator habitat. And we'll go into a lot more detail about what that might mean. But just to take some general principles of native plant gardens and landscapes first. So when we think of these kinds of gardens and landscapes, we know that they are healthy and diverse. And by healthy, and diverse, we mean we have lots of different types of plants within the garden, and they are well suited to the site that we've planted them or that we're finding them. We have these gardens are full of life, so they have lots and lots of different organisms besides the plants. And so we have soil organisms, we have insects, we have pollinators, of course, we have small mammals, we have birds, and this kind of garden fosters that type of life. They are sustainable gardens, so they're sustainable, meaning that they will persist. Most of the plants are perennials, and they will persist for year after year. They are maintained with low inputs. And by low inputs, I mean, we don't mow, obviously. We don't fertilize, because fertilizer would tend to give an advantage to weeds. These plants that we're growing have extensive root systems underground, and fertilizer tends to encourage the above ground growth. So we really don't need fertilizer at all. We don't use insecticides or herbicides, with the exception of very limited use of herbicides in the case of certain persistent perennial weeds. We would use them for a limited amount of time, a limited spot use, and then have the problem solved, hopefully. The only input that we do need to use is our own energy and our own interest and our own weeding power. So we do get to still weed, and after we're done weeding out weeds, we might be managing the gardens by actually managing some of the more aggressive native plants. These plants are of a place. And what I mean by that is they are from the place, they're regional, they're from the place where we are growing them, and they can help us identify what kind of place that is. So if we're in southern Wisconsin, we'll grow southern Wisconsin plants, and we could look at the garden and we could kind of locate ourselves in a geographic sense by seeing what plants are doing well there, what plants are growing there. So someone could come and learn a lot about the southern Wisconsin flora by looking at some of our gardens. The plants are adapted to the climate and the soils, and this makes things easier when you're gardening, because you're not trying to grow plants that are not suited to our winters or not suited to drought periods that we might have, or that are plants that are not suited to our soils. We follow nature in terms of the plants that we use in the sites that we're gardening in. These gardens are dynamic, they're always changing. So from week to week, from season to season, and even over the period of years, as say an area becomes more shaded, or if we lose a tree or have a tree taken down, it becomes more sunny. So then the ground layer plants would be responding accordingly. And they're so interesting. There's always something to learn about, always something to observe, always something to see when we're gardening with native plants. So today I want to cover some topics of plant selection, and these are the main goals of plant selection. First, to consider the scale of the planting area that we're talking about, and you may want to approach it gradually, or you maybe have a very large area that you're concerned with, just depending on what kind of project you're undertaking. The most important thing is to match the sites and plants, and to choose the native plants for your region, as I was just mentioning. Garden and landscape care, we'll talk a little bit about that scale of the planted area and what the care would involve. Some tips about caring for this kind of garden, whether you're in an urban area or a suburban area or even in a rural area. And then some sustainable gardening and land management practices that I wanted to highlight for you. So this is the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum native plant garden area. The garden is located around the visitor center at the Arboretum. It's just 4 acres, and it's surrounded further then by the horticultural collection, which you see here to the right of the native plant garden. And then the Curtis Prairie is to the left of the native plant garden. And of course, we do see plants moving from place to place, even across those kinds of spaces. So there'll be some seeds from horticultural plants coming into the native plant garden. There'll be some prairie plants coming in, and there'll be some plants going from the native plant garden to both of those areas as well. I did want to point out that we are in a context as well of 14 neighborhoods of Madison that surround the Arboretum. And as we're thinking about pollinators, it's not at all surprising that larger pollinators, like say honeybees, bumblebees, maybe the larger wasps, could easily fly from the neighborhoods to the Arboretum and back again. So they could have a nest in the Arboretum, but be foraging throughout this whole, what you see in this photo. And some of the smaller pollinators would have a much more limited area where they live. So they might only exist within the native plant garden or within overlap of the garden and the prairie. So there are a number of ways to approach native plant gardening, of course, and pollinator gardening by extension, is that you can have a planting design, and this is just an example here on the left-hand side of a planting design for one small section of our native plant garden. We have a garden designer, Daryl Morrison, who has been working with us for over 20 years on this project. So he did the original design, studied the site, matched the plants and the different garden areas to each site, and in many cases did drawings like the one you see on the left there, which show the species and where to place them, where to plant them, where the circulation and the paths are, and so forth. This particular garden has a little building within it, and that building is represents in this garden design like a small house. So you would see the south, which is toward the bottom of the diagram there. the plant, the little dots and the colors there look different than the ones at the north of the building. And that's because the south side of the building has a different microclimate and a different exposure, and the north side has the northern exposure, which means that the conditions are different and different plants would be successful there. So that kind of thought goes into a full-fledged design. And you could see some of the design principles on the right-hand picture in place there with paths, curved paths, and curved lines for the beds of the gardens, shadow and light, different species, no gradation by height or anything like that. It's very naturalistic. And just to highlight that the Wild Ones group has a website, on their website, they have a number of planting designs that would be useful for home gardeners, kind of your own an approach that might help you get out started if you were interested in starting with a planting design. But there's also another way to do it, which is just to start with a few favorite plants that you would like to grow and that that interest you and also have good pollinator value. So here on the left, we see the cardinal flower again, the red one, the Culver's root again, that's the white spikes, the mountain mint with more flat topped or rounded inflorescence, and the yellow sweet black-eyed Susan. Then in the upper, on the upper right there, we have in a semi-shaded area, we have the giant purple hyssop and the elm-leafed goldenrod growing together. Those will both do well with a little bit of shade. And there you have a tiny hummingbird in the middle of that picture. Hummingbirds actually like this hyssop very much, and it's a great bee and hummingbird plant, so I do recommend it. Then we also have the lovely native grasses, and they don't really have a floral attraction, but in the fall, when the last few goldenrods are blooming, as you can see in that lower picture, we remember that the native grasses, the native bunch grasses, can be a very useful place for insects to nest near the bunch grasses or in the thatch that gathers around those clumps. So we don't want to leave out the grasses. This is the most important characteristic the most important advice that I can give you about your plantings. If your plants are matched appropriately if the plants are matched to the site appropriately, you will have the best chance of success. The plants will do the best, and the plant community that you're trying to bring together will have the most success. I like to share these two pictures because I took them not at the garden here, but in a natural area where there are two habitats. These pictures were taken about 20 yards from each other, and one of them is the birdfoot violet, which is a very dry, it likes very dry habitats, exposed rock outcrops. You can see it's growing there with a little bit of Pennsylvania sedge, very, very dry, exposed, thin soils, very well drained. Whatever soils there is very well drained. And then the other picture was taken about 20 yards away, but it's a mesic of spring ephemeral, Dutchman's breeches, and growing well there with a lot of mosses and other spring ephemerals. And the explanation for these two pictures being so close together is that they're on opposite sides, south and north, of a very, very narrow ridge. So just even though they're physically close together, they're a world apart in terms of the habitat that the plants are growing in. So keeping those things in mind is so important. There are a lot of resources for you to use to find out what plants grow together well in community and what plants grow well in which habitats. So I've highlighted a few here. The Vegetation of Wisconsin is a classic book by John Curtis that describes plant communities. And so you can look up certain species that you're interested in, find out what communities they grow in, and you can use that as your guide. The flora of the Chicago region does apply to southern Wisconsin. If you're in if you're further from southern Wisconsin or you're not in the Chicago region, you might want to see if there's another resource for your area that you could use. But that one shows you which plants grow together. So we would look up, say, Dutchman's breeches in that book, and we would find all the plants that Dutchman's breeches grows well with together. And so that's a great resource. Native plant nursery websites and catalogs are also a good source. Lots of mixes of seeds or mixes of plants that are designed to grow well together on the same kind of site. So check those out. And then there are plant selection tools where you enter your zip code. And so Pollinator Partnership is an example of that. You enter your zip code no matter where you live, and it will give you some resources and guides for that. I have a reference, a link to references for you at the end of the talk. So you can pick up that link and access these resources in more detail. So I want to just go through some of the plants and how they're growing together in different situations in our garden here at the Arboretum, and give you a little insight as to how the area started. This was an area that had established maple trees, very large trees. I think you can get a sense from those trunks there. So 20 years ago, when the garden was first being begun, this site was very compacted soil. It had been on the pathway from the parking lot to the restroom, and it had been really well worn down over the years. It was slow to get the woodland plants going in there, but it did work out well in the end. So this is the understory. We have the wild ginger, and we have some ferns, the maidenhair ferns just coming up through the ginger in this picture. There are many other spring ephemerals in this picture, and I'll have a slide later on to show you a wider view. But just to know that you don't have to start with you don't really have to amend the soil, other than having the leaf compost just remaining on the ground and breaking down, and eventually with a lot of planting and a lot of care, you can come up with a garden even on an area that seems very unlikely. This is the Mesic Prairie Garden, so kind of a classic tall grass prairie. And I'm happy to say that at this very moment, this is exactly what this garden looks like right now, with spiderwort and the yellow Heliopsis or ox-eye just starting to bloom. So this is what it looks like today. This was a lawn, just a regular untreated turf grass lawn, and the soils were fill soil and rocky fill soil that had been added to build out the slope to make a more gradual slope for our wheelchair accessible pathways. So this is a south facing slope, medium soils, and the plants this is a analogous to the Curtis prairie or to a tall grass prairie. And this is an area that was very challenging at first. You can see the very beginnings of the plantings. I will mention that all of our gardens here at the Arboretum and the Native Plant Garden were started from plugs and small plants. We have done some overseeding, but most of it was just done by planting small plants and then them filling in. And they do fill in rather quickly. So this garden was planted, I would not, the soil is really heavy clay. It was really near the construction zone, very heavily traveled with the construction machines and all. So this was a wet mesic planting, and we have planted in there, according to the landscape plan, the prairie blazing star. There's some Joe Pye weed. There's, as I'm telling you about that right-hand picture, the Culver's root is the white one. And then that kind of in the mid distance, there is a yellow-green kind of fluffy looking plant. That is actually the grassleaf goldenrod. So it is not quite blooming at the time that this picture was taken, but soon to be blooming. And many other plants. So each picture is just a snapshot of one point in time, but each garden has built into it plants that would have already bloomed and plants that will be blooming in the future throughout the whole season. This garden grew very well, actually, and the clay helped hold moisture when there was moisture available. And this garden is also on the way from the downspouts to the rain garden. So it does get water draining across it, and that is a great place for water supply, as well as just the water that falls on it. But you can see it's surrounded by flagstone and by asphalt pathways. So the garden really looked literally, when it was first planted, looks like on the left, that was the beginning of the planting. And then this second picture would have been like 2 years later. We have plants that are suitable for these well-drained soils and like sunny rock gardens and other areas that don't seem like they'd be possible for larger plants. So some of these smaller prairie plants are excellent for those areas. So the prairie smoke there on the left, the shooting star in the middle, and the June grass and the prairie phlox here at the right-hand side. Those two flowers, plants are blooming right now. The prairie phlox is that bright pink or purple color. It varies in color. And the June grass with that, it's a short grass, a cool season grass, blooming with those fluffy flower heads now. And then, of course, we always have a little bit of shade or an area that's semi-shaded. Maybe it's shaded for most of the day, but has sun on part of the day. And this is such an area. So it's a semi-shaded, it's an edge habitat. And I would characterize the soils there as being dry mesic to mesic, depending on where on the slope you are. But this is woodland phlox, Sprengel's sedge is an early blooming sedge, which does very well in the shade. And bishop's cap, another one of the woodland plants, and wild geranium growing together in this composition. In dry or dry mesic sites, we're going to be looking for, we can grow plants that are a little bit larger and more, and can grow well together, such as the butterfly weed here at the left with the white sage. And then the butterfly weed, of course, it grows as single plants and clumps that get bigger and bigger, and it can seed itself, but it doesn't spread rhizomatously through the garden. And then the white sage does spread rhizomatously through the garden. So it's a good idea with that one, in my opinion, to plant your plants first and then maybe put a white sage in later so that the other plants already have kind of a head start on it. The silky aster is another nice one for dry areas. It doesn't respond very well to competition, so you do want to have an open area for it, or an edge of a prairie perhaps. And it has very large flowers, well, like an inch across, but the plant itself is rather small. And I really like that one. You can see how full it is when it's blooming. And then in mesic or wet mesic sites, so these are sort of on the wet end of medium soils, you have the bottle gentian growing well. That is a fascinating plant for pollinators because the bumblebees, they're in full bloom there, and the bumblebees have to force their way in. And then the red milkweed, which has a very interesting floral structure, but it grows, of all of our native milkweeds, this is the one that does the best in the moister areas. And you can utilize around your building, as I mentioned before briefly, you can utilize the microclimates. So microclimate here, in the case of this area that we're looking at now, is the north side of our visitor center. And we have some woodland wildflowers that grow really close to the building, but further out from the building, maybe 10 or 12 feet further from the building, they don't do well. So even a distance as small as that you might have at your own home can be utilized. You can grow the woodland plants right next to the building and then grade into more sun-loving plants as you come further away. And the woodland plants are active in the very early spring before the other plants have gotten big. So it works out time-wise as well. Here we have wild geranium, golden alexanders, and the columbine. And what we've noticed about some of these is the columbine and the golden alexander seed very effectively, but they do well if there's a little bit of disturbance for them to seed into. So we'll always find now in these established gardens, we find the columbine kind of near the edge or where there's open space, and that's where it can seed successfully. So feel free to collect your seeds from these plants and then go to that kind of spot and sow them there. This is a rain garden. This is our little rain garden at the Arboretum. So this is when it was first being planted. It's almost impossible for me to picture this now, but you can see that plants were put in with plugs. It just gets a little bit of rain from the roof there and it gets the rest of the water from the air conditioner of the building. This is what it looked like a couple years later. Here we have very large angelica at the right there. That's long past blooming at midsummer when this picture was taken. We have boneset is the white one, and the red milkweed, as I mentioned before, in this wetter area. And I just want to make the point that when we're growing a pollinator garden, we're not thinking of just single pollinators, each one being helped by our garden. We're thinking of the different ways that these interconnect and support each other, actually. So we all know the story of monarchs and how reliant they are on milkweed as their caterpillar food. So here's a monarch, a female monarch in the upper left, laying her eggs on a common milkweed. And then we know that milkweed, when it's blooming, has a terrific amount of nectar. So it's attracting all kinds of insects and pollinators alike. So there's another little butterfly. There's all bees will visit, wasps, flies, you name it, beetles, to get that nectar, because the nectar is very accessible on milkweed. But the pollen is not. And the structure of the flower is such that the pollen has very specialized a way of traveling away from one flower to another. And there are little pollen packets, like little pouches that have the pollen in, and a little hook or a connector between two of those that gets stuck on the pollinator's legs. And so here we see a bumblebee with these little golden packets hanging down, even one at the mandible. And this bee has visited a milkweed and is now hopefully going to return to another milkweed because it's carrying those pollen packets on its legs. And it doesn't collect these pollen packets to feed its young as bees normally do. It's just carrying them along as it travels from flower to flower. Milkweed does not bloom all season long. So other sources, the monarchs need other sources of nectar, of course, throughout their whole life cycle before they migrate, and especially just before they migrate because they're building up their fat stores. So monarch, here's the monarch nectaring on the meadow blazing star. This is one of their very favorite plants. So if you're really encouraging a monarch garden, you would want to see if you could include that plant. It does well in medium to wet mesic conditions, and the monarchs will really can congregate on it when it's blooming. So we see that the bumblebees and other large pollinators are actually very crucial to this cycle of monarch survival and milkweed reproduction. And so we're looking for connections like that so that we know that we are really supporting whole systems and not just focusing on one single species and trying to and leaving out an important part of the cycle. So these are some planting guidelines for just the basics of the plant. The things that I run into the most, questions I run into the most from people, and issues that I see when people are pointing out that they've had a problem with their garden. With planting the plants, we want to plant each plant at the proper height in the soil. So this means not too low, not too deep, or not too high. If you were going to air, it's better to air a little bit high, but then make sure there's adequate, that they get watered adequately. Sometimes people are wanting to give the plant a really good start, and they've learned that with some plants you can plant deeper and then the plant will be stronger. But in the case of these plugs, you really want to get right at the level. Some of them have their growing points near soil level, and if you plant them a little deeper, they might get covered and not do as well in the initial growth. We water them really thoroughly on planting day, and you can see an example of a garden in this picture here where we watered each plant thoroughly. And then we used a light leaf litter mulch on them. This is not a heavy mulch. It's just a light mulch to kind of hold the soil moisture, even as we go through, drying cycles and so forth, especially when we have heat or hot days interspersed with more seasonable days. And then with the native plants, because many of them are perennials, or almost all perennials, and they do increase either in the clump size or they're in a bunch, so you can divide the bunches. You want to think about their growth and development pattern. So for plants that are mid-season, blooming in mid-season, a great time to divide them and work with them is first thing in the spring, when you can first see that they're coming up. And you can divide them at that point and transplant them as the same way that you would plant a small plug. And then with ephemerals, so if you have the spring woodland plants, you want to plant them in their dormant season. So right now, a lot of the nurseries now in June are having sales of bare root ephemerals. And so this is a good time. They've already gone dormant. And so their next growth season will be next spring. And that's a good way to gain some more ephemerals if you're looking for that. If you're using seed, and so you can see that this picture is showing not a real small garden, but rather a larger restoration kind of area. If you're using seed, whether it be in a smaller area or in a large area, you want to make sure the seed is ripe when you harvest it, if you're harvesting your own. Of course, if you're ordering seed, you think about when the seeds are ripe, and that is a good time to judge when they would be dispersed naturally, and you could disperse them then if you can get good soil contact. This was a stream restoration area, so the banks were tapered back from the stream, and so it was clear. At the time that these seeds were put down, there was a lot of bare soil. There were, of course, still some plants that came back at this point, but that would have been the next season. We usually sow seed mixes in late fall, and you get good seed. If you can get good seed soil contact, that's what you're after. And then some of the seeds that we're planting will need a cold moist treatment. And basically that's the equivalent of winter to break their dormancy. Some seeds don't need a dormant period. Some examples are grasses generally don't need a dormant period. So if you harvest some grasses, some June grass in a few weeks from the June grass that's already bloomed, you could plant that, and with a good watering situation in July or August, those would germinate, and tiny little June grasses would be growing in your garden at that point. Most of the forbs do need a cold moist treatment. You can look that up in a nursery catalog, but an example of one that doesn't is Monarda. And so if you're interested in pollinators, you could grow a Monarda from seed. You could start it sooner than you wouldn't have to wait a year. This is the wildflower garden that I was mentioning before that has a little more, you can see a little more diversity here. We want to maximize the number and diversity of native plants in the landscape. So we want lots of kinds of plants. We want, if possible, we want blooms throughout the season. And this is an example, the woodland garden is an example of a place where you really get most of the blooming in the understory in the spring, and then not too much during the summer. And then there are some late summer species to use. But this garden that I'm showing you here has basswood trees in it, and they are in the canopy. And of course, basswood is an excellent pollinator tree, and it's just about to come into bloom now in late June. You want to have a succession of flowering throughout the season. So you want to have plants in bloom in your garden, preferably more than one species at any given time. And that gives different pollinators the chance to visit your plants. It also provides a little bit of redundancy. If one plant has a bad year overall, or say it's very, very hot during its bloom time and it has a very short bloom season, then there'll be other plants in bloom that could be possible resources for the pollinators. And also I want to point out with that lower picture in the lower left, the bunch grasses, again, we just want to make sure that we have a lot of diversity. It shouldn't be just all flowers. There should be some grasses and other maybe sedges or other kinds of plants to help support the forbs, but also just to provide that nesting possibility as well. I do encourage people to plant the straight species. These are the native species, but of course, some cultivars are visited by pollinators and are useful to pollinators, and some cultivars are not. So a reason I qualify that by saying evaluate the pollinator use of cultivars is just that if you have the opportunity to see cultivars blooming or observe them or try one, you can see whether insects are using it. There is a growing amount of research on cultivars and how useful they are to pollinators. So that would be another place to look for resources on which cultivars you might choose. In my garden, I don't use cultivars unless I know that they are as good or better than the straight species for pollinator use. This example is from the West Madison Agricultural Station in west side of Madison, and they have a Baptisia demonstration garden. So this is the native white wild indigo is there at the right, but they have all different color varieties and types there at that garden. So you can take pictures and you can observe them and see what, this is a case of the black and gold bumblebee using both of these. And you can see both of those bees are collecting pollen on the leg there of the bee. You can see that they've collected pollen. So I don't know whether they collected it exactly from this plant, but they are visiting all the Baptisias and collecting pollen. We want to avoid pesticides, especially the systemic insecticides, and we want to make sure that our nursery plants have not been treated while they were being produced. So we might not know that just from looking at the plant. The systemic insecticides are used, they can be used as a seed treatment or a soil drench. And of course, when those compounds go into the plant, they're taken up by the plant, they're in the tissue of the plant, and they're in the pollen and they're in the nectar. And we know that that is detrimental to insects that are feeding on the plant, but it can also be detrimental to insects that are using the pollen and the nectar as well. These plants that you're seeing here are from a native plant nursery that they will be definitely proud to say that they do not treat their plants, but you may want to check that for other sources, because if a nursery doesn't have it labeled or doesn't know or can't really assure you that they are not treated, then they might be treated. For other garden practices, we like to have some little bit messy areas, if you will, incorporating logs or rocks, like a rock pile like this, have leaf litter retained and have some buffer areas if possible, where things are a little bit more like nature like nature's gardening would handle it. I like to recommend avoiding landscape fabric or rocks for mulch and thick layers of even wood chip mulch, because then you don't have any access to the soil and insects can't make nests. They can't emerge if they were already there. And you can use plants themselves to make a more dense, almost a living mulch, if you will. We leave the material standing over the winter, and when the temperatures are, we either trim it in the spring. In some cases, we do use prescribed fire, but that material throughout the winter has lots of seeds in it. It provides cover, it provides food in some cases, and the plants are not harmed by having the material there. In the winter, one practical reason here at the Arboretum is you can see that in areas where we've left the plant material, the ground layer plant material, it's pretty obvious where the garden is. And so people don't walk over the garden areas and make trails over the garden areas during the snow season. We do trim it in the spring, and we just put that material, we just put in a cold compost or kind of windrow it. And if you're doing this work in the spring at about when the daytime temperatures are about 50 degrees for about a week, the insects and things that are overwintering within that material will begin to emerge. And if you have it windrowed, they can continue to emerge wherever you put it. Here's an important thing if you're doing pollinator gardening that turns out to be really fun, is to document your garden. So we, one of the things that we've been able to document in our garden here at the Arboretum for now about 10 years is the rusty patch bumblebee. And now that Bumblebee Brigade is a project for the DNR, established project with the DNR, we can submit our photos and report our findings, our sightings to Bumblebee Brigade, and that continues to build a record for the entire state. So I hope that many people who are doing pollinator gardening will be able to add this dimension of bumblebee monitoring. You just do it with photography. This is here's a rusty patch worker on that lavender hyssop, and here a future queen bumblebee on the showy goldenrod. We like to include cues to care. This can be helpful if you're in an urban garden where people might be a little unsure about how your garden is your garden being cared for? If you have a good distinct edge on your garden, maybe a border there. This is a curved border of one of our gardens. It becomes very obvious this is an intentional garden, and that can be important in communicating and just having people enjoy your garden. Little interpretive signs are helpful too. Pollinator habitat. This is a Monarda field apparently, but Monarda in the early part of the garden will be very prevalent like this. Later on, it won't be quite so prevalent, but there are many other species growing with it, so it's not just solid Monarda. Share what you are doing with your community, with your neighbors, with children, with schools, and you can harvest and share seeds. I mean, these days with the jumping worms, we're not sharing plants as much anymore, but sharing seeds and sharing native seeds is another way to connect with people and connect people with conservation action. So I just want to point out, I do get questions from people that sometimes a larger scale project is in the works. And this is just an example of a rural area with some restoration going on. And so some of the ways that we manage in these that are not possible perhaps in the urban setting or suburban setting, prescribed fire, doing a lot of removal of invasive plants and brush, but also the monitoring. So this is just some examples of things on a broader scale, and some people are gardening or restoring at that scale too. So we have lots of pollinators. As you are documenting your pollinators, be sure you take pictures. These are just pictures I've taken while photographing bumblebees. You can get identifications of Wisconsin butterflies for the butterflies, or at bugguide.net for other insects. There's some flies. There's a bumblebee mimic fly there in the upper right. There's a beetle. Bugguide.net, there will be people who will help you ID them. Wasps. This is a giant golden digger wasp carrying a cicada there at the right. She was getting a good grip on it so that she could fly across the prairie and provision her egg with that giant cicada for it to develop. These are some of the cavity nesting bees. We have 500 species of bees in Wisconsin, so there's lots of bees you'll find on your flowers. These are ground nesting bees. They are solitary bees, but they provision their eggs underground. So all the bees are collecting pollen and feeding those to their young. Here is the link for Bumblebee Brigade. It will be appearing on your reference sheet as well. So this is a project I'd encourage everyone to get involved in. You can learn more than just identification from photographing bumblebees. You can learn behavior. You can learn about the timing and the reproduction, the emergence of the queen bumblebees. And you can learn about how the different bumblebee species are using the floral resources. They don't use all of them the same. So I just want to thank the students, staff, and all the volunteers who help take care of the gardens and who have helped monitor bumblebees. And all the experts who have helped us learn about bumblebees from scratch, and those who are promoting sustainable gardening, and all of you who I hope are enjoying a great spring and summer, early summer now of doing native plant gardening. So thank you. And I can take questions. This link on this, let's see if I can get the link. Whoops, go back there. I want that. Is the link showing, Tim? Okay, the link there. The link there is a link to a handout, basically. So everyone who has that link, if you want to take a picture of it, write it down, record it somehow. That link will lead you to a handout which has more detail about the different resources that I mentioned in the talk.
Thanks, Susan. I did put the link in the chat for everyone that is participating today. So we do have a few questions for you before we take off here. So I will start that. The first question is, are there any statewide assistance or resources available to towns or governments looking to naturalize or use no-mow in their town roads to support pollinator habitats that you're aware of?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I would go there. There may be local, I mean, first of all, sometimes you have to go through a lot of paperwork or, you know, advocacy to be able to do a project like that, like the medians or the, or kind of areas that are community areas that are kind of open. But I do know of examples where, say, within a city, there was an area identified which would be a good place for a pollinator garden, and just neighbors of that area persisted and created pollinator garden there, and they engaged the neighborhood. The garden has been incredibly successful. It's just beautiful, and they were able to get plants from like programs like you know, small grant programs and that kind of thing. So I think the local entities are where to start with that. If it's a larger thing like a township road program, I do know from personal experience that you can run into some resistance with that because people aren't interested in, they have other competing needs like mowing for snow plowing, future snow plowing. But there are ways to you know, to just start the conversation. And really, I think it takes a lot of advocacy, maybe more than resources at first, but there are options for getting you know, in different cities and different towns for getting plant resources as well. Private landowners can be helpful because sometimes they have plants where they've been harvesting seed, and they'll actually donate seed for a project like that. So there's a lot of networking to do and a lot of advocacy to do and a lot of conversations to have. But I appreciate people wanting to do that. It's really important.
Okay, next question. We have a question here from Peggy. I have a small prairie garden, or a small prairie on my property, which over the past several years has been invaded by raspberry brambles. I recently contacted a prairie expert who will be helping me to eradicate it. Any ideas on how to keep this from reoccurring? I've burned the prairie, dug these up, cut them down over the past years, and they keep coming back. Any ideas? Yes,
well, brambles are I don't have a great answer for that. I know people, my own land included, where in areas where you want to control brambles, you're in for a very challenging, tedious job. But one thing to remember about them is that they are a plant of disturbance, and fire is actually a disturbance. So the fire tends to renew them, restart them, and they will fruit on the second year growth. So if you burn every year, you're kind of keeping it in perpetual youth, if you will. And most people do for control are doing the like clip and a tiny spot of herbicide on that cut stem. that's very tedious. I know people mow them sometimes just to get them down so that they're, not low mowing, but, pretty high mowing, just to get them down so you can kind of like get through the area. But that's challenging. It's very challenging, but we might think about might try an area where you let them, where you just on her site, where she just tries an area where she lets them get old and see if they decline. It might take some years, but see if they decline by that method instead of continual disturbance, which tends to keep them going.
Susan, do you find that trying to create a root barrier sometimes works?
With with brambles?
Yeah.
I'm sort of visualizing her question as being about like a large area where you wouldn't be able to do that. They will tip root too, though, so they'll arch over and they'll go over the boundaries if you had them. But anything like that would be worth trying, especially if you have a more smaller area and a more controlled area where you could experiment with it. I would a lot of the things that we learn are learned through trying something and seeing what works.
Trial and error. All right. The next question is, what is the best way to identify your soil type or moisture level? Because I know you were talking about different regions, and they're just wondering what's the best way to identify that?
Right. Well, one way to identify it one way to start is to look at what's growing well there now, even if it's weedy or, whatever. But if you're talking about a site, analyze it now in terms of what plants are doing well there. That's how I usually ask people about when they are emailing me or calling me with questions about their location. I like to ask people what's doing well there now, and then kind of what's your vision for it? Where are you hoping it heads? And if it turns out they say, well, there's a lot of cattails, or there's, other plants that are associating with more of a moist area, then that gives me a clue about the soil. You can always do a soil analysis and find out the composition of your soil, but it might be tricky if you have a large area. For example, our garden here at the Arboretum is 4 acres, and we have everything in this garden from very well drained soils to heavy clay in the areas that we have not done any soil amendment. So it can vary over a pretty small distance. And I think if you have a more homogeneous area, you could look at how you could try some plants, to see whether they will do well there. In other words, use plants that have a pretty wide amplitude of moisture, so they could do well with it a little bit dry, they could do well with a little bit wet, and they do well in the middle. And then the plants may help tell you whether this spot is good for them. And if you can find a few plants that grow very well in your area, or they're already growing well in your area and they are native plants, then look up those plants if you're here in southern Wisconsin, in the plants of the Chicago region, and see what plants all are accompanying those plants in plant communities, and add those plants back in.
Good advice. Use cues of nature.
Yep.
Our next question here, and I know you touched on this a bit, Susan, but how do you prepare your site? I have a natural area, but it's completely taken over. I need to prepare it to plant.
Okay, so I would want to know what it was taken over with. That would be the first, I guess, my first question in that. Site preparation is super important, and I didn't really go into that now. The scale of the area will be a big factor. Some plants you don't have to worry about very much. So let's say I have a field and it's been disturbed, or it's a disturbed area, and it's full of daisy fleabane. In that case, I would probably and I were using plants, I would just cut down the daisy fleabane, or you could pull it, but I probably just cut it down and plant within that. We have used because the daisy fleabane is not going to compete long-term with your natives. You'd want to maybe top it off so it didn't seed, but there are some persistent weeds that you would have to get rid of before you plant it. So some examples of that are perennial Canada thistle, things that are just going to be a problem in the long run, you know, if you don't take care of them at first. We've used a number of techniques over 20 years here at the Arboretum. There was a period where we were using Roundup to kill turf grass and prepare the site that way. We would treat it, leave it for about 3 weeks to a month, and then we would go back and plant the plugs directly. We would sometimes top dress with some leaf mulch or something like that. We've also used a smother technique, so putting down thick layers of wet newspaper or cardboard, and then some weight on top of that, soil or compost, and then let that smother and then plant into that. We've used a sod cutter and remove the sod with a sod cutter and basically prepared the site that way. So those are the main ways that we've done it here. You can use one technique I'm eager to try, although I don't have a location to try this at right now, would be to solarize it. And that's where you put clear plastic over the area and you anchor it down and seal it around the edges. So you trench and put the, and it has to be like heavy plastic, maybe hoop house plastic, something like that, like discarded hoop house plastic, and that provides, it makes it like a small flat greenhouse, and there's a lot of germination and weeds dying under there, and then that can be a helpful preparation method as well. I don't usually recommend tilling because tilling brings up a lot, it breaks up some of the perennial rhizomes to continue to live, and it also brings up a lot of weed seeds from soils that are disturbed and have a lot of seed bank of weed seeds in them. So that can be a little trickier, but I would try this. I would definitely be interested in anyone who's trying the solarizing to let me know how successful they are with that one too.
Thank you, Susan. We got a few more questions. We'll try to get to them.
Okay.
The next one is, as milkweeds are rich in alkaloids, do they impact growth of other normal plants growing next to them? Can these toxins leach into the soil or through air and stop other insects coming near them, which do not feed on milkweed? So a question about milkweed.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I have not observed any kind of allelopathy or suppression of other plants around milkweed. It seems to, we've never planted common milkweed in our garden, and we have lovely stands of it, scattered around. It could, could it be doing something like that? I mean, there are many influences of plants that we might not really be able to observe that well. But I don't think, it doesn't show anything. I've never really seen anything that I would point to as being suppressing other plants. It does have alkaloids, and obviously that's what confers the protection for the monarch caterpillars. They're able to feed on it, but many other insects use milkweed too. So it's not exclusive, it's not that exclusive. I'm sure there are some that are harmed by it. Obviously, it's not a good forage plant for livestock, and people use it in, but in a cook. I think that some of the small pods can be cooked and eaten, but don't quote me on that either. So I guess I don't think it has a suppressing effect on other plants.
Yeah, I would agree. I haven't seen anything like that in the gardens in this area. So I guess that maybe for some further research.
Then there's all the different kinds of milkweeds, and they seem to appeal to the monarchs a little bit differently. Some seem to be used more than others. If there was a choice, if the monarchs had a choice.
Yeah, interesting.
Real interesting question. Thank you for that.
Yeah. The next question here says, what what is the best mulch or recommendation for mulch to be used for newly planted areas, especially in for weed control as well when you're.
Okay, yeah, weed control, we usually just use it for that kind of moisture retention that I mentioned, because we're prepared to deal with weeds. When I had a new garden this last summer we did sod cutting, and then it was just a lawn, turf grass lawn, sod cutting, and I was so surprised that the weed that was the most prevalent in the early moments of that sod coming off was pokeweed. It was just a forest of pokeweed over the whole area. So you're going to have probably have some weeding if you're starting with plugs. If you're starting with seeds, you do it a different way. You allow the plants to grow and you keep it mowed at about 8 to 12 inches. So a real rough mow, high mow. And that allows the native plants to grow and developing their root systems and growing slowly. And the weeds are growing fast and you're topping them off so they don't reproduce. You do that for a couple of years and then you let the plants go, and the prairie plants should have a good advantage by that time. I didn't do any areas here with that technique just because it doesn't look much like a garden for the few years that you're rough mowing it. And that just didn't seem to be as inspirational perhaps as having the plugs and having kind of an instant garden. You plant the small plugs and within a few weeks they're filling in and they're covering the ground space and they're getting quite tall, and some of them are even blooming that first year.
Awesome, Susan. Well, thank you so much. It is 1 o'clock, so that is all we have time for. I do apologize if we did not get to your question. And just to note, the recording will be posted on our website later this week, and then you'll have access to this presentation. So thank you so much, and happy National Pollinator Week, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.